All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Aspen Room. We're going to start another talk. Today, for this talk, we have Maureen Thompson and Marley Dunning, a systematic review of beavers positively influence the majority of Oregon conservation strategy priority species.
Hi, I'm Marley, and I'm really excited to be here today to share our work looking at the relationship between beavers and beaver-managed floodplains and the Oregon Conservation Strategy priority species. Before I get started, I want to thank the Oregon Natural Desert Association. I did most of this work as their Hillis intern, and it wouldn't have been possible without their funding and support, so thank you. So getting right into things, why beavers and beaver-managed floodplains? As I'm sure we all know, beavers are an incredible keystone species. I have this awesome infographic from the USGS highlighting just some of the incredible ecological effects that we observe when beavers are present on the landscape long term. And looking at this figure, it's not hard to see why they're dubbed nature's Swiss Army knives, and it's also not a far jump to start thinking about the implications for conservation. Which takes me to the Oregon Conservation Strategy. This is Oregon's federally approved conservation plan for conserving and recovering sensitive and imperiled plant animal strategy species across our state. It also conserves our habitats, and it combines science and conservation priorities with recommended voluntary actions and tools for Oregonians to define their own conservation role. And that's their mission statement from their website. And within this conservation strategy, we have strategy species, strategy habitats, conservation opportunity areas, and key conservation issues, which is a lot of content. And so just based off of time and funding, I've really just focused on the strategy species, or the 294 species of greatest conservation need. And so connecting the dots between beavers and conservation and these strategy species, or SGCN, we're left with this question of what the relationship is between beavers and these strategy species in the context of conservation. And our specific question was whether or not there were benefits to these species from beavers, such that beavers and beaver-managed floodplains should be afforded special conservation recognition in Oregon in the context of this conservation strategy. And before I get into how we address that question, I do want to highlight that within our strategy habitats, wetlands are listed. And so you might be wondering why beaver-managed floodplains and beaver wetlands should be afforded more recognition when wetlands are already being considered, which is a good question, but as I'm sure many of you know, there are some pretty important differences between beaver wetlands and other wetlands. So in beaver wetlands, we often observe more native species and more species heterogeneity. And when we're thinking about this conservation strategy, wanting to protect our native species and native biodiversity, we really want to focus our efforts into the habitats most conducive to that, which in this case are beaver wetlands and beaver-managed floodplains. And so, having established our question, how did we try to answer it? I did a massive literature review. I looked at 320 sources, mostly peer-reviewed publications and government publications, although there were others as well, as you can see from the table. And looking at the breakdown by publication year, it's really interesting to see that some of this research has been going on for over 70 years, which is really impressive how far back that knowledge goes. But most of it has been published within the last 20 years or so, which part of that is intentional. I wanted to draw from the data that had been most recently published, but it's really impressive to see just how much recent knowledge there is to pull from. Before I continue, I want to highlight the order of the taxa, amphibian, bird, and fish. That will be important, and we're going to return to it when we get to results. So once I had read all of these sources or looked at them, I wanted to then put each of the species on the list into an assessment category relative to beavers. So the first category was benefits. These are species with direct evidence substantiating that beavers support this species. So the Oregon spotted frog has published data from a graduate thesis showing that beavers support this species. Next were species that probably benefit. So for most of the species on the list, there wasn't any direct source linking them to beavers. So I read about their ecological needs and the ecological effects of beavers and tried to line things up from there. And so species in this category were those where it seemed like their ecological needs would be met by the ecological effects of beaver from the published literature. So my example for this is the peregrine falcon, which lives in riparian areas and predates on things like small mammals. These are things that beavers are known to do from literature. And so it seems like, from what we know, that beavers would really only do good things for the peregrine falcon, but there's no direct link there in the data yet. Next were species that were neutral or possible benefit. So the Pacific giant octopus is on the list. This species lives in the ocean where beavers don't live. But beavers do live in estuaries, and evidence suggests that beavers can support populations of fish in estuaries, and octopi eat fish. And so from this weaker link, it seems as though octopi could be supported by beavers, but there's really not a lot of data out there. And so species in this category kind of have a weaker link, and we need more data to really substantiate that relationship more. Next were species that were neutral. So these are species where beavers probably wouldn't benefit or harm. So for example, the blue rockfish spends its whole life in the ocean, where again, beavers don't live. And there's no published literature about beavers supporting the blue rockfish or their prey species or anything like that. So it really seems like beavers would do nothing for the blue rockfish in any direction. Next were species that were data deficient. These are species with unclear evidence or just insufficient evidence. So there are a lot of vernal pool species on the list, like the dwarf meadow foam. And these are species with really strict water requirements. Too much water is not good, and too little water is also not good. And so the presence of a beaver, which unilaterally increases water availability, it's kind of hard to predict what would happen to the dwarf meadow foam in that situation. Finally, there are species that are unlikely to benefit. These are species where evidence shows that beavers would probably adversely affect these species. For example, kit foxes, data shows that increased open water is detrimental to this species, which is something that beavers are associated with. So once I had read all of the sources and put all of the species into assessment categories, we then wanted to look at the numbers and get into the results. I'm going to pass it over to Maureen, my co-author.
Thanks, Marley. So looking at some big picture results, this is how these 6 assessment categories map across those 294 species. And so we can see that the top half of this pie chart, benefits and benefits likely, makes up 50% of these 294 species. And if we look over to those neutral and possible benefit species, that brings us up to 74% that could benefit from beaver modified habitat. But we also wanted to look at this across taxa. And so we can just see that there's a lot of variety in the number of taxa included in the Oregon Conservation Strategy, but across these 7 bar charts, there are some trends in that you can see a lot of green. The first thing that I want to call out is that fish have the greatest number of known beneficial relationships with beaver modified habitat. So 15 of those 60 listed species are known to benefit from beaver modified habitat. But I also want to call attention to reptiles, because there are only 5 reptiles included in the Oregon Conservation Strategy, and they are all known or likely to benefit from beaver modified habitat. 2 of those species known to benefit are Oregon's only 2 native turtle species. They're both in decline, they're both on the strategy list, and they both benefit from beaver modified habitat. Another thing I want to point out is if you remember back a few slides ago to that data accumulation chart, amphibians, birds, and fish were leading, meaning we had the most resources to pull from about their relationships to beaver modified habitat. And these are also the taxa where the highest proportion of species are known to benefit from beaver modified habitat. So that casts a favorable light on a lot of these unknown and data deficient categories. Another thing I want to point out is plants. Plants have the greatest number of species included in the Oregon Conservation Strategy, but we can see the trends are really different for them. So there are a lot of species that are data deficient and unlikely to benefit. So a lot of those unlikely to benefit plants are plants that have really limited ranges, specific geologic associations, specific soil types that they live in. And fully 33% of the plants are data deficient in relationship to beaver modified habitat. But a lot of them are really data deficient overall. Like, there are no photos of them, there's no natural history information available about them, and there's no habitat requirements for them. So even if beavers don't protect these species, we're really missing something about recovering these species. But the main takeaway is that the benefits of beaver modified habitat span across taxa, aquatic, and terrestrial species. So we also wanted to look at how these patterns map across state and federally listed species. So actually not all species on the Oregon Conservation Strategy are on any state or federal list, which is interesting. And of course there's some, but not all overlap. So there's some species that are federally listed and some that are state listed. And so this chart just includes those 189 species of those 294 that have some listing status. So first I want to talk about state-sensitive species. Because we can see that 81% of the state-sensitive species are known or likely to benefit from beaver-modified habitat. And if we look at the neutral and possible category, that brings it up to 96%. And this is so huge because the Oregon Conservation Strategy is all about elective and preventative action, and this is an area where we could really see some gains for state-sensitive species before they're more imperiled. The next thing I want to talk about is federally threatened and endangered species. We can see that 44% of these species are known or likely to benefit from beaver-modified habitat. And if we include those neutral and possible species, that makes 65% of these species that could benefit from beaver-modified habitat. And again, that's just so huge. These are species with really different life histories, and they are imperiled, and this is a really expensive federal obligation for the state to uphold, and it's just so rare to see one conservation action that could uplift so many different species. The next thing I want to call attention to is the data deficient column. So second from the right, you can see that that column is pretty dark. And so the greatest number of state endangered species, 32%, are data deficient in their relationship to beaver-modified habitat. And these species likely face unique threats in Oregon, and conservation at the state level is really unlikely to recover these species alone. So we have more work to do in understanding how to support these state endangered species that are data deficient. We also wanted to look at how these patterns map across space. So the Oregon Conservation Strategy identifies 9 ecoregions, and these are portions of the state with similar climate and vegetation. And it also identifies the species of greatest conservation need known to reside in each. And so using those designations from 2016, we mapped how these assessment categories fall across the different ecoregions. And so each pie chart overlaid on each ecoregion shows the relationship to the species of greatest conservation need in each to beaver-modified habitat. And you can see, again, a lot of green across all the charts. The relationships actually skew higher when you look at it this way because a lot of those data-deficient species have limited ranges. And so species that have larger ranges have more data behind them, and that data indicates that beavers benefit them. So benefits likely, that second most green category, is the largest slice of the pie in all 8 land-based ecoregions. And the exception to this is in the nearshore. So in the nearshore, we can see that the neutral possible and neutral pie slices make up about more than 75% of the pie. So nowhere do these positive results skew higher than in the East Cascades, where Marley and I live, where fully 90% of the species of greatest conservation need are known or likely to benefit from beaver-modified habitat, which again is just so exciting because this area is suffering from a lot of drought and extreme wildfires, and it's just so encouraging to see so many imperiled species uplifted by beaver-modified habitat. So looking forward, the Oregon Conservation Strategy gets revised every 10 years to incorporate new science, data, tools, and resources, and that happens again in 2026, so right around the corner. And so the new revision is meant to focus conservation action and direct funding opportunities to have effective and efficient conservation actions. And the role of science and policy in determining which species warrant conservation attention at a state level is largely discretionary. So our analysis suggests that including beavers and beaver-modified habitat as strategy species and strategy habitat really offers substantial potential to achieve those lofty conservation aims for the state. And I hope that in sharing this data analysis and review, We have highlighted some areas of potential future research and really exciting alignments of interest for immediate conservation action. And we actually have a lot of time for questions. We thought we only had 15 minutes, so we'd be glad to chat with you about your thoughts about incorporating beavers in species recovery strategies. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Test, test.
Have you had other state agencies reach out about your results here?
Well, we actually just submitted them for a peer review recently. And interestingly enough, I'm on the technical review committee for Oregon, but I also haven't had any contact about this. Cool, thanks.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My understanding is that sometimes species are designated as threatened or endangered because there's so little known about them rather than being designated as data deficient as a different category. For the species where you were finding that beavers, or like the connection to beavers was sort of a data deficiency in your analysis, do you have a sense of how many of those species were classified as endangered in the first place just because there's so little known about them versus like a species where maybe we know lots about why they're threatened, but just don't know about the connection to beavers?
Do you want to take that? That's a great question. Off the top of my head, I don't know the numbers. Most of the species that had like little to nothing about them were, there were some plant species, as we discussed before, that were like narrowly endemic. And for those, I think it's very possible that that's why they were listed. But there were also several like snail species, and there were a few other invertebrates that were listed, and I don't believe that they were like afforded that like state endangered species. Just, and I would have to go back to my data and check this, but those seem to be like independently, like totally lacking data, which I thought was very interesting.
Hi, thank you. That was very interesting. I was wondering if you could tell a little bit more about when you related the data to the ecoregions or the natural regions. Was that based on where the plants typically grew, or just how you split the data? Could you just explain that a little more for me?
Yeah, so the ecoregion listing is something that is like on the page. It was something that was a part of the conservation strategy. And so when I first looked at the list of species, there was like a column for ecoregions, and it just kind of said which one they lived in. And so that was a designation that like happens at the state level. And so when I first did this analysis, and I started thinking about ways to break it down to get a better idea of not just like the overall numbers, but how we could look at it in terms of like taxa and state distribution, that was like right there. And so I was like, okay, well, they've given us these ecoregions. Let's see how the numbers look across ecoregions. So, yeah.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
So yeah, we thought about doing it with like red list data, places that have like a little bit more granular information, but we also wanted to use this to inform the Oregon conservation strategy. And so we're like, well, if we use their inputs, I feel like they will trust it. And so it also was just easier. We're like, okay, if this is the area you agree that they live, then we'll just use the information you've provided.
Hi. So using the OCS data that was provided to you and the significant results that y'all showed here, what is the course of action that OCS is going to take when it comes to, the beavers and restoring habitats? Do you think they're going to make an action plan and put something together where they're going to utilize beavers in these habitats? Are they waiting for the peer review paper to come out to make that decision? And furthermore, who would they be working with to do that? Is that something you all do, or is that something that's going to have to be factored out to like ODFW or something along those lines?
I can if you want to.
Do you want to like split it? I have a few thoughts. So that's a great question. So the Oregon conservation strategy itself, it's not actually like an action plan necessarily. It's recommended actions, and it opens avenues for funding pretty much. So every state has one of these action plans, and so the idea with this project was like this acknowledgement of how incredible these results could be, and the inclusion of beavers and beaver managed floodplains would, more outreach, more education, and like also another avenue for funding. So that was my thought on this, but I don't know if you have other things to add.
Let's see here. Like, who will it? I think that's good, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if that answered it, but I think there's other legislation in Oregon that is more like beaver restoration centered that is outside of the OCS.
Thank you. That was really similar to what I was going to ask. So you kind of answered most of what I was going to ask, just about like how you're going to use your findings, which are very intriguing to kind of inform the new kind of update to the Oregon Conservation Strategy Plan. But are there other ways that you plan on using this data for, like, maybe the currently ODF and W and the state of Oregon is working on a beaver management action plan, or other ideas like that to try to help kind of encourage managing beavers for the sensitive species?
I feel like once this is out there, then if they saw value in it and if the Oregon Conservation Strategy team incorporated it, then that gives a sort of internal buy-in that makes it easier. So if we think back to that sort of double-ended chart from yesterday, if anyone was in the same session as me, I feel like incorporating beavers in 2016 maybe would have been a bold move. But looking at how much data has accumulated since then and seeing it all distilled in this way that really relates exactly to their own aims, then it seems like 2026 certainly wouldn't be early to incorporate, and missing including beavers would make it really late.
Where do you plan to publish? Where you plan to publish, or where do you want to publish?
It's pending in biological conservation, so who knows, but yeah, stay tuned. Well, thanks, everyone.
Okay.